to learn Create Sew. In this lesson, let's talk about how to sew a seam. First, you should make sure that your machine is properly threaded. If you need help on how to thread your machine, I have some links below to how to thread Brother sewing machines. You can also search for your particular make and model and find videos for how to thread. When you're ready to sew your seam, take 2 pieces of fabric. Your fabric has a right side and a wrong side. The right side of your fabric usually has more vibrant color. The wrong side is more pale. To sew your seam, place your fabric right sides together. This means that the pretty side of the fabric is touching, and you'll be looking at the wrong side. Along one of the edges, we're going to sew our seam. When you sew, you have to leave what's called a seam allowance. The seam allowance is the space from the edge of the fabric to your stitches. You have to have a seam allowance so that your stitches don't fall off, otherwise you could end up with a hole. For most standard store-bought patterns, we use a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This means we're going to be sewing 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. We're going to start by sewing the seam on a Brother mechanical machine. This is the GX37. It's a pretty standard mechanical machine. And on the mechanical machine, to select your stitches, you turn a knob. The most common stitches that we're going to use is the straight stitch, which on my machine is number 2, as well as a zigzag, which on this machine is number 3. Right now you can see that my knob is turned to the number 2, which means I'm ready to sew my straight stitch. For most seams, you're going to want a stitch length of 2.5. A stitch length of 2.5 works for most fabrics, such as cottons and flannels. For fabric that's really thick, such as fleece or felt, you may want a longer stitch length, such as 3.5. Before you start sewing, it's really important that you check the width of your stitch. On a mechanical machine, the width often changes your needle position. So as I move my width from left to right, as I move that dial, it moves my needle. When I have my dial set to about 2.5, as indicated on my machine, it makes it set to the center. You want it to match up with the markings for your seam allowance so that you get an accurate measure. On this machine, having the needle in the center will align it with your markings. When I have my needle in the center position, my 1/4 inch guide mark is right here. This is 3/8, 1/2, and 5/8. Make sure that you're familiar with the guides on your machine in order to sew your seam. The dial on the far left controls the tension. Most of the time you're going to want this set to about 4. If your stitches look funny, either too tight or too loose, you can adjust the tension. Make sure that you rethread your machine every time that you adjust your tension, and make sure that your presser foot is up when you do so. When you're ready to sew, place your fabric underneath the presser foot. Align the edge of your fabric with your guide mark. I'm going to be sewing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, so I have the edge of my fabric aligning with that mark. You also want your needle to be positioned about a 1/4 inch from the edge. So here's the back edge of my fabric. About a 1/4 inch in front of that is where the needle is going to come down. So I'm going to hold my thread behind my presser foot and I'm going to lower the needle down. I'm just doing this with my hand knob. And then I'm going to hold my back stitch button. Now I'm going to turn my machine on and I'm going to hold this button down with my right hand and I'm going to guide my fabric with my left hand and I'm going to press real slowly, and this is going to make me go back just a few stitches. Now that I've created a few back stitches, which will act as a knot, I'm going to line up this edge with the 5/8 and keep sewing. Again, when you begin, you want to hold your thread tails to the back. This will help prevent tangles on the back side of your fabric. slow down as you come to the edge. About 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, stop, hit your back stitch button and hold it down, and go back about 3 or 4 stitches, and then let it come forward again. Lift your needle up, lift up your presser foot, slide your fabric out and lift it up and over the little blade on the edge of your machine and pull. And this will cut your threads. When you're done sewing your seam, it's always a good habit to trim your threads. Then open your fabric and you'll see that you have a nice finished seam and the raw edges are trapped on the back. You can sew seams in different sizes using the guide marks on your machine. Don't forget to backstitch every time you start and stop a seam. Unless it tells you not to do so, backstitching is really important. It acts like a knot, and without those, your seam will come undone.